As much as we romanticize over camera gear, a camera is only as good as it is practical and comfortable in the hands of the photographer that's using it. A camera that might work well for one person might not be a great experience for another. It's why the whole best camera debate is tired and kind of unnecessary. What matters is the camera you use works for what you're trying to do, and part of that involves how you've set up your camera, which with today's increasingly more complex digital cameras is probably more important now than ever. Now, what you might find from this video is that a lot of what I talk about could be applied to other Fujifilm cameras, some of the new ones and even some of the old ones. And that's because for the most part, most Fujifilm cameras have a similar design philosophy to them. The internal camera settings, the menu, and how they all generally operate are pretty similar. Now, of course, these settings aren't going to make you take better photos. They might not even really work for how you like to shoot. They work for me, and that's really all I can really speak on. But maybe there's a thing or two that you could carry over to your own setup. Maybe you just got a new camera and you need a place to start. Hopefully this video can be of some help. Without further ado, this is how I've set up my Fujifilm X-T5. So when it comes to exposure settings, there are three modes that I shoot in: a semi-auto exposure mode, an aperture priority mode, and manual mode. Depending on the situation I'm in, I'll use any of these three modes. But for the most part, I like to shoot in aperture priority mode. This simply means I get to choose what aperture I'm shooting at, and the camera automatically adjusts the shutter speed and the ISO. Aperture priority works pretty well for how I shoot because I like to keep a deep depth of field in my images. It also makes getting pinpoint focus less of a necessity. Because I have that deeper depth of field, more things are going to be in focus. Sometimes I won't even have to focus because most of what I'm shooting is already in focus. For street photography, that saves a ton of time and makes it a lot less likely that I would miss a shot because I missed focus. Now, there are times when I shoot in aperture priority that my shutter speed goes a bit lower than I want, and it results in some unintentional motion blur. Sometimes I'll keep it intentionally, but if I don't want it in my image, I can just bump up my shutter speed using the dial, and the camera will then push the ISO higher. Keeping a relatively high ISO range is key to this, so I've set my ISO to have a base level of 125 and a limit of 6400, keeping the shutter speed at auto. What's really nice about Fujifilm cameras like this X-T5 is that I have all three of the main exposure settings easily accessible by these physical dials. You know, if I'm shooting in manual, I don't even have to look at my screen to see where I'm at settings-wise. That said, there is also something nice about not having to worry at all about my settings. And that's something that I've also played around with on my X-T5. Something I did a lot on my X-E4 as well. I would set that camera to P mode, which is program shift. Essentially, that means my ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are all set to auto. While this is technically fully automatic, I like to add a bit more creative control, so I probably call it semi-automatic. Just to clarify, we're still talking about camera settings. The reason I say semi-automatic exposure is because I will set my metering mode to spot. This essentially lets me choose where the camera is metering and automatically exposing for. So I still have some control over how the camera exposes. To shoot this way, I have the AEL button set to my auto exposure lock, and I make sure that the AE/AF lock mode setting is set to switch. This means you won't have to keep your finger pressed down on the AEL button to lock exposure. I can just point to where I want to expose, lock exposure, and then compose my image. This is a no-fuss way of using your camera in auto exposure, and I highly suggest it to anyone who's struggling on the street with their settings and just want to, kind of treat their camera as a point-and-shoot camera. Before we continue, I want to take a quick second to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace, an all-in-one platform for anyone to showcase their work, sell products, and run their business. I've used them for over 6 years now, and my Squarespace site has become an essential part of how I run my business as a solo creator on YouTube. It's a powerful way for me to showcase that I'm a photographer to strangers on the street. I'll simply pull up my website through the shortcuts feature on my iPhone, and it'll bring me right to a page on my site with some of my favorite images. You don't need to know coding, nor do you need to have much experience with website design to get started. Squarespace makes it really easy for anyone to make a professional looking site with their easy to use platform and website templates. So if you're interested, you can try out Squarespace for free by starting a free trial using the link squarespace.com/Faisal, and when you're ready to take the next step, you can use the code Faisal to get 10% off your first purchase. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. Digital cameras these days have a lot of settings and a lot of buttons. With so many buttons, it can lead to actually setting the camera up to be more complicated than it actually needs to be. I've personally been guilty of programming every single button on my camera to do something special. So special that I never even ended up needing to use that setting. In fact, setting those buttons to those settings got more in the way of what I was doing just by handling the camera. Trust me, you see this screen and it's pretty enticing to just set up every button to do something. But if you don't see yourself actually needing to set a setting to a physical button on the camera, I advise you to stop there and don't set it to anything, because it's just going to be another button that you could accidentally press and end up screwing up a photo you're trying to take. So in an effort to prevent any accidental settings changes to my camera, I just stick to programming some of the buttons on the X-T5 to settings that I use all of the time. That's my short TED Talk on that subject. Let's get into how I've set up the buttons on my X-T5. Starting with two of the most essential buttons, the AF on button and the AEL button. I like to use back button focusing, so I've kept the AF on button set to AF on. I also keep the AEL button set to auto exposure lock. I'll mention it again here. The AEAF lock mode setting is set to switch. This way I don't have to keep my finger pressed down on this AEL button to activate auto exposure lock. Other than the shutter button, these two buttons probably get the most use. So the fact that they're conveniently placed and easy to reach with my thumb is great. Now this is sort of where things start to get a bit more personalized to how I like to shoot. I've switched the quick menu, which by default is set to the Q button. I've moved that to this top function button, and I've programmed the Q button to be my photometry setting. The reason being is that I use my photometry setting a lot more than the quick menu, and the Q button is just more conveniently placed and easy for my thumb to reach. So it's just a lot more comfortable than trying to press this smaller button on the top of the camera. Yeah, we're getting into the very fine details here, but you think it might not matter, but it really is more important than you think. The view mode button here on the side of the viewfinder, I've set this to my autofocus mode switch. I like that it's out of place so I can't accidentally hit it. I'll get into more of my autofocus settings in a later section, but continuing on here, you'll see that the D-pad function settings aren't set to anything. And again, the whole reason is this whole section of the camera is where your hand presses into the camera. So these buttons, in my experience, are the easiest to accidentally press. And in the past, when I've had settings set to these buttons, it would just always get in the way more than anything. Maybe I'm just clumsy, but if I can prevent this from happening and I can just have those settings that were originally set to the D-pad and move them to the quick menu, I'll do that. And that's what I do. I've set the rear dial to focus lock. This is something that I've programmed more for video, but because I like to use back button focusing, there really is no need for focus lock while in the stills mode. I really wish Fujifilm would take a note from Sony and let you program all of the function buttons to be different in both the stills and video mode, but that's a rant for a different day. That's it for this function menu setting. There are some more function buttons that I've tweaked as well though. For example, the focus lever switch, which is this knob here, I've got this set to just push to zoom. This acts as a focus check, so whenever I'm shooting with a manual focus lens, it'll just punch into what I'm looking at, and it's a lot easier to finally adjust my focus manually. One of the things I wish Fujifilm updated with this new X-T5 design is physical locks for the drive mode switch and the exposure compensation dial. You know, they have locks for the ISO and for the shutter speed dial. You know, I don't know why they wouldn't just continue having locks for the other switches here, but there is a workaround to locking these functions if you don't use them like I do. If you go into the button settings, you can find this function lock setting menu. And here you can choose pretty much all of the function buttons on the camera, and you can lock them. Since I don't use the exposure compensation dial, and I'm perfectly fine with staying in just one drive mode all the time, I locked both of these settings. Now if I ever accidentally move any of these dials or press these buttons, nothing's gonna happen. And that's just the way I like it. What I love about Fujifilm cameras is I could theoretically lock every single function button on this camera and still be able to use this camera in the most simplest form possible. I might actually try that. In case you're wondering what I have in the quick menu, I've just got a few settings here. These are the settings that, you know, I might change every once in a while depending on the specific situation. So here I've got my film simulation setting, dynamic range setting, white balance, self timer, face detect setting, subject detect setting, and shutter type. For the most part, I like to shoot in mechanical shutter. I just like that noise and that responsive feedback, I guess, from hearing it whenever I click the shutter. My go-to film simulation is just straight up default Astia. I do edit all of my photos from RAW, but when it comes to the preview and what I see in the back of the camera, more often than not, I have it to Astia, which is pretty similar to how I would edit my photos anyway. You can't do wrong with that film simulation, in my opinion. Alright, let's talk focus settings. Like I mentioned before, I use back button focusing. So this means I'm opting for the AF on button to be my focus button, and then I've also disabled the shutter focus setting. You can disable shutter AF in the button dial setting here. As for the focus mode, I'll stay in continuous or shoot in manual if I'm using a manual focus lens, but there is no need for me to go into single point focus. And I'll mention why in a bit here. In the continuous focus mode, I've set the autofocus mode to be wide/tracking. This lets me continuously track moving subjects, but also have the ability to just focus on a single point if I want to. So I can either press and hold the AF on button to track a subject, or just press it once quickly for the regular single point focus. So in a way, I sort of get continuous autofocus and single point focus under this one setting. I don't have to flip this switch in the front of the camera every time to go between both of those modes. Some other notable focus settings I should mention here are making sure pre-AF is turned off. Usually this is by default, but essentially it means your camera's just automatically focusing no matter what. Certainly, I don't want that. I like to keep AF plus MF on. This essentially means whenever I hold down the AF on button, I'm also activating the manual focus ring on my lens. This is super handy whenever I am focusing on a reflection. Sometimes in those scenarios, the camera doesn't know where to autofocus correctly, so being able to override autofocus and use manual focus really helps. One last setting here is I have interlock spot AE and focus area is set to off. What this means is my metering point isn't going to be tied to my autofocus point. I like to have full control over where exactly I'm metering, so this basically allows for that. So that about covers the basics of how I've set the X-T5 for street photography. For the most part, it's really all about simplicity for me. If there's a setting I use all the time, I try to make it as easily accessible as can be. And if there's a setting I don't use all the time, I try to keep it out of the way as best as I can. When it comes to my street photography, how I use the camera is pretty simple. Most of the job is really done outside of how the camera works. But the point is that I try to make the camera as user-friendly for myself as I can make it. And I think a lot of other photographers could benefit from that same idea. Like always, guys, let me know in the comments if you have any other questions about my particular setup here. I'll try my best to get to as many of you as I can. With that said, if you found this video helpful at all, tell a friend, like, subscribe for more videos. I hope to see you guys in the next one. All right, peace.